Hey Caleb, it's March 3rd, and the temperature is actually the same as the date. I'm not sure the last time it was only 3 degrees in March, but there are definitely some crazy climate things going on. I agree that the verdict is still out on whether humanity is to blame for the climate issues or not, but today I'd like to talk about something that we know is the fault of humans. As you know, we grew up 1 block away from a literal toxic waste dump. This sign was on the fence on 2 sides of the block we lived on. And here's an aerial view of where we grew up. Our house is right here, in this huge open area that looks like beautiful green space right by the river. That is 54 acres of toxic waste buried in the ground. Here's a closer look at where we lived, and this block is where we rode our bikes all the time growing up. Luckily, there were some chintzy chain-linked fences to keep us away from the toxic waste. And right next to this fence was a fairly deep ditch that was really fun to play in. Little did we know that the chemicals were seeping out of the clay pits and contaminating the groundwater, which of course flows to the lowest point. Like a ditch. Anyway, I've been reading a lot about this mess of chemical sludge because Emory University of Atlanta, Georgia has taken over the PBB registry. They've also extended their study to anyone who lived in the St. Louis area and wants to be a participant. What is PBB? Well, I'm glad you asked. PBB stands for polybrominated biphenyl, which was a fire retardant chemical that was produced by the Velsicol Chemical Corporation. Now this is just one of the slew of toxic chemicals that were produced from that plant, but this is the only study on the long-term effects of PBB exposure. And before anyone else watching this video thinks, well, good thing I didn't grow up on a toxic waste dump like the Vances, I should also point out that 90% of Michiganders have elevated PBB levels compared to the rest of the country. But how could that be? I've never been to St. Louis, Michigan before. Again, so glad you asked. You see, the Velsicol Chemical Corporation manufactured all sorts of things. One of them was a fire retardant chemical, PBB, they called Firemaster. The other was a supplement to cattle feed that they called Nutrimaster. Unfortunately, they didn't quite master either of these nearly as much as the name would have you think. And don't ask me who thought it was a good idea to produce cattle feed supplements in the same place they produce all sorts of hazardous materials. In 1973, there was a horrible trifecta that caused the most costly and disastrous agricultural event in the entire United States history. Most of the plant's regular workers were on strike. The plant ran out of the bags they normally ship PBB in, so guess what they used? They put the PBB in Nutrimaster bags and put a Firemaster stencil on them. And then, the PBB was put in the same warehouse as the cattle feed supplement. Unfortunately, the shipping department and Farm Bureau, who mixed the supplement into the cattle feed and then shipped it all over Michigan, didn't realize the difference between the Firemaster and the Nutrimaster bags. It took a little over a year before anyone figured out that this is what was making all the cattle sick. When they did discover it, they had to slaughter entire herds of cattle, and most of the farmers lost everything they had. But at this point, the meat and dairy had already been sold for almost a year, and authorities estimate that almost every single person in the Lower Peninsula ingested some PBB. Eventually, they closed the entire plant down and literally buried it on site. They put it in clay-lined pits in the 54 acres of land around the house we grew up in. If this was the only problem from the Velsicol plant, this would still be a catastrophe. But it gets worse. After the initial cleanup, it became a priority again in 1999 when they found out that the clay pits were leaking chemicals both into the Pine River and the groundwater around it. Not just PBB, but also all sorts of other various chemicals. St. Louis, Michigan is now in the top 20 most polluted places in the United States. The Environmental Protection Agency has a special name for large environmental cleanup projects called Superfund sites. Some of these sites are so huge they get a special designation of megasite. A Superfund megasite is any site that costs more than $50 million to clean up. From 1999 to 2006, they spent over $100 million to clean up the Velsicol site. Then after reassessing it, the EPA recommended a $373 million cleanup project. It only takes over $50 million to make it a megasite, and they are almost spending $500 million to clean this up. This project could take as many as 50 years, but it is expected to be finished in 2032. That seems like such a long ways away. We had better have flying cars by that point, or at least hoverboards. Come on, science. So little old St. Louis, Michigan, even though most people have never heard of it, has the most expensive Superfund mega site in the EPA's Region 5. I'm honestly not sure how it ranks with other parts of the US because it is really hard to find exact numbers on how much is spent on Superfund megasites. So anyway, Emory University is trying to study the long-term effects of exposure to PBB, and I'm going to participate in their study this Friday. They already know there's a correlation between people who have high levels of PBB in their system and breast cancer, lymphoma, as well as neurological, immunological, dermatological, and musculoskeletal effects. The problem is they don't have any conclusive evidence that PBB is what's causing all of these things. Hopefully my participation will help them learn a little more about this nasty chemical and possibly even how to treat people who've been exposed to it. Whether humans are responsible for climate change or not, we sure have made a mess of a lot of other things. But luckily there are also humans out there who are trying to clean up this mess and help those who've been exposed to it. Have a great week, Caleb. See you later.